Well, this morning, let's turn to Genesis chapter 13. We finished the book of 1 Peter. I'm going to speak from Genesis today. And then next week, as I mentioned, we'll have a guest speaker. And then we get into Palm Sunday, I think. And so I'll prepare a fitting message for Palm Sunday. And then Good Friday and Easter. And so this is where we're headed with what we're looking at in God's Word. I do try to make my titles for my message appropriate to what I'll speak on. And they're not always catchy little phrases. I don't necessarily go for that, and I don't not go for that. But certainly the title today is interesting in light of what we're going to look at from Genesis 13. So I'm going to talk to you about a little about a lot of choices. A little about a lot of choices. And so Genesis 13, if you would follow along with me, I'm going to read verses 1 through 13. Genesis 13, starting in verse 1. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, the Canaanites and Perizzites, which dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "One's philosophy is not best expressed in words. It is expressed in the choices one makes." And an old proverb states, "He who chooses the beginning of a road chooses the place it leads to." I do realize that most of us, are very familiar with the story of Lot. Nevertheless, I would like us to consider the choices Lot made and where those choices led him. In doing so, I want to encourage us to consider our own choices and where they could lead us. Lot was Abraham's nephew. He's called Abram at first, but when Lot's father died, Abraham took Lot in, you could say, and Lot came along for the ride when Abraham moved at God's calling. Lot certainly had possessions and wealth. You saw that in verse 5. He had flocks and herds and tents, plural. And then, of course, it talks about how together their possessions and their wealth was great. In Genesis chapters 13 to 19, we see all these choices that Lot made. And I want you to notice, first of all, the choice of destination. And I won't read it again because we just read it, but if you'll focus on verses 9 to 11, and you'll see the choice of destination. In making his choice, Lot appears to have had no concern for others. Without consideration for his uncle, Lot made a choice to take what was best for himself. You could say he really owed everything to Abraham for where he was, and yet he didn't seem to care where Abraham's livestock would pasture and get water. We don't really see any gratitude in him for Abraham, no consideration for those around him, so no concern for others. And we could say, especially as we move forward through this, that he had no concern for family. All Lot saw at the time when Abraham said, "Let there not be contention among us, one will go one way and the other," is all that he saw was green grass, water, and flashy cities. And the potential, I believe, for more wealth that would come. But no other concerns seemed to come into play. One day, a certain rich man visited his pastor. He was very concerned about the pastor's sermon on money. He didn't like it. The pastor led him over to a window overlooking a park and said to the rich man, "What do you see?" The rich man said, "Well, I see men and women and children." And then the pastor led him to a mirror. And again he said, "What do you see?" And the rich man said, "Well, I see myself." And then the pastor said this, "You know, the window is made of a simple piece of glass, and the mirror is made of a simple piece of glass. The difference, however, is that the glass of the mirror is backed by silver." And then he said this, "There is a tendency that when you add a lot of silver into your life, it is very difficult to see anyone but yourself." I think we kind of understand what he was trying to get across there. Well, it seems to me that Lot had trouble seeing anyone but himself. So Lot made a choice of destination, and then he made a choice of direction. And you'll see that in verse 12. Lot chose a direction by where he set up his home. On the surface, it may seem to be of little consequence, but it was of great consequence as we continue to work through this real-life story. And I think every morning he'd wake up, the first thing he'd see would be this hedonistic city of Sodom. And that had great an impact on him. And I think slowly over time it chipped away at Lot, as certain things can do that to a man and a woman. History tells us of a close associate of Augustine, a man named Alypius. He was known to absolutely detest the brutal contests of the gladiators. His neighbors, we are told, constantly urged him, cajoled him to come and watch the games, but he refused. Somehow, one day, they physically tricked him into going into the amphitheater, and he sat there. But his conviction against the brutality of what was witnessed there was so great that he closed his eyes and he refused to watch. After a while, however, the piercing cries from the arena floor, as well as from the cheers of the crowd, began to arouse his interest, if you might say. And he opened his eyes for a moment, seeing the battle for life and death, and finally seeing this death blow given to a gladiator. Those images had an effect on him. He came back to the games, and with the next event, he too shouted along with the mobs. He eventually became addicted to these games and became one of the greatest proponents of the gladiator contests. But here's the thing, those games changed him. Those that knew him before said that the games changed him. He was no longer a gentle man. He was different. I think it goes to say that what we gaze at, we dwell on. What we dwell on affects the way that we think. And what we think about eventually affects what we do and maybe even who we become. Well, this was the case with Lot. Lot's choices of destination and direction created a desire. And so again in verse 12, you can see the choice of desire. Pastor Tom just read from Psalm 1 and verse 1. Maybe that's an entire passage you've memorized before, maybe at least the first two verses. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Do you see a negative progression there? It's there. First one casually picks up on the philosophy of the ungodly, which may lead to standing in the way of sinners or with sinners in sin. And then there's a sitting, and that sitting is a full participation with the scorners. And I believe that is eventually what happened to Lot. First, he chose a poor destination, followed by a poor direction, which led to a place where there were wrong desires, and we're going to see in just a minute where he was actually sitting among the scorners. It would do us all well to remember that one bad choice tends to lead to another. Now notice in Genesis chapter 14, verse 12, that Lot was taken captive while in Sodom by enemy kings, and Abraham had to form an army to fight against the kings and deliver Lot from the captors. And that leads us to another choice I believe Lot made, and I'd like to call it the choice of a do-over, or a second chance to get it right. Look at Genesis 14:16. Lot is rescued. He's taken back by his uncle. You would think this would be an opportunity for Lot, get a second chance. He could start over. He could make new choices, better choices. But unfortunately, he didn't. In fact, he went back, but he didn't just go back. Because if you look at Genesis 19:1, if you would turn there, just flip a few pages, Genesis 19:1, and see where he is next. In 19:1 it says, "Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground." So now we see Lot he's some sort of leader in the city of Sodom. Perhaps some sort of magistrate. If you look at these ancient cities, these ancient biblical cities, it is at the gate where a lot of business is done, including making judgments. And so there he is. And I don't need to remind you that this was a wicked city. I mean, we have a whole term today that's used based on these cities, Sodom. And so it's a wicked city. There is gross sexual sin that was rampant there. And this is now the city that Lot is some sort of leader in. What does that say about Lot? Now, I'd like to pause for just a moment to make a few points of applications from this. You might say directions for us. Number one, when we make a series of choices, those choices soon or can soon define who we are. 4 bad choices marked Lot as a failure. No one wants to become like Lot, yet there are some people that make a series of bad choices that can lead to becoming like a Lot. Number 2, have you considered your choices and where they are leading you and your family? Realize this, there really are very few choices in life that are totally non-consequential. a lot of little choices made over time can have a big effect. Where are your destination choices leading you and your children? And I want to address the fathers. What about the choices you make that have a bearing on your family? What effect do they have? Do they have the potential to help your family? Or could they even have the potential to be harmful to your family? Do they have the potential to help your kids spiritually or harm your kids spiritually? I mean, no one goes out saying, boy, I'd like to make some choices that will hurt my family spiritually, but we need to think, what choices are we making and what effect can they have on our wife and our children and our family? And maybe even others beyond that. Number 3, do your choices show concern for God and others, or do you only think about yourself and your desires? Do you care about how your choices will affect others? And when you make choices, do you look ahead to see where those choices just might lead you and your family? Maybe some of you are currently thinking about some life choices. Can I urge you to think through these things before making them? And then number 4, are your choices spiritual, or do you make choices based mostly on self and material benefits? I have to tell you that over the years I've seen, in some cases, spiritual destruction that has taken place as a result of decisions that were made without the consideration as to what is best for the spiritual benefit of a family or a child or a teenager. For example, dads, there are bad results when you choose to become unfaithful in church attendance. Young adults, there are bad results when you make decisions to date unsaved or unspiritual people. There are bad results when you make educational decisions with your children without considering the spiritual impact those decisions might make. There are bad results when you move for a job promotion but move where there's no good church or school for your family. I saw this happen to a family in Maine. And just radical change that took place just over a very short time because father made a decision. And he told me it was a promotion and it was going to bring with it significant increase in his salary. But there was no good church. His kids were in the very influential years of their life. There was no Christian school for his kids. And it had devastating effects. In fact, that family is totally broken up to this day. And I just really think that a lot of it was because of those choices. We need to be careful. And then I would say that there are bad results when spiritual priorities take a back seat to all other priorities. I could go on, but the point is this: we must consider the spiritual impact of the decisions that we make. I'd like to shift gears again a little bit here with the remainder of the time that we have and talk about the consequences of bad choices as seen in the life of Lot. Probably many of you have heard this before. Someone once said, "Sin will take you further than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay, and it'll cost you more than you want to pay." So with Lot, we see that sinful choices cost his testimony. And let's make that personal. Sinful choices will cost us our testimony. And I think one of the places, and I'm going to broaden this term, you'll see what I mean in the life of Lot and his family, but cost us our testimony in the community. So for Lot, it was among those people in Sodom. But for us, think about community as a big umbrella with a lot of little communities underneath that. You understand what I mean? I'm not just talking about our testimony in the town of Williston or the testimony in the town you live in. Just various communities, because you're a Christian. And remember what a lot of the application from 1 Peter was. As a Christian, there's a way that God has commanded you to live. And the hope is that those that are unsaved will see Christ in you. They'll see a changed life that may lead an interest into the gospel for themselves, that may even be in part someone coming to Christ. And so you think about community in those terms. If you remember, God intended to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. So 2 angels came to the city. Lot saw them as he sat at the gate of the city. He invited them to his house. But when the men of the city heard about the visitors, they came to Lot's house and they demanded to see the men that they might have relations with them. It is here that we see he lost all influence in the community. If you'll look at Genesis 19, verse 9, you're there in chapter 19, look at verse 9. And they said, "Stand back." They were very aggressive. They then said, "This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. Look at what they said. It's very interesting the way that is worded. The accusation of these horrible men suggests that Lot had made moral pronouncements before, and I would assume he's made these pronouncements at the city gate, but his judgment was no longer tolerable for them. So I want to ask us, what kind of testimony do we have with those around us, particularly the unsaved, particularly unbelievers? How are you influencing those around you that don't know Christ? What kind of influence have you had for the Lord? Do people see spiritual life in you? How much positive influence have you had? And do people know what you stand for, and do they know what you stand against? There was a loss of testimony in the community, and then there was a loss of testimony in the family. And I would say this had to be the worst of all for Lot. Because notice verses 12 to 14, and I will read those verses. Look at Genesis 19, 12 to 14. It says, "Then the men said to Lot, 'Have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place. For he will destroy this place because the outcry against them was grown great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it.' So Lot went out," now notice this, "and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, 'Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city.' But to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be what? Joking. Wow. Now Lot's own family won't even believe him. When he tried to warn his sons-in-law, they thought he was jesting, that he was joking. I don't know. There's probably things worse than that, but that's in there, right? Some of the worst things that could happen to a father, the head of a family. Very, very sad. And can I ask you this morning, are you living as you should before your family? What is your testimony at home? What do those closest to you know you to be? Because we can fake it sometimes. We can fake and be hypocritical and maybe have everyone convinced in the church that we're spiritual. But most likely those people that are closest to you, they do know who you really are. Maybe not in depth, unless you're really good at faking it and holding secrets. This is just a horrible commentary on Lot in his life. And we see that sinful choices cause us to lose the very things that we desire. Now look at verses 16 to 19, and I'll continue from there. Verse 16 of chapter 19. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. So it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed." And Lot said to them, "Please, no, my lords. Indeed, now your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die." Really interesting what takes place there. Lot lost all that he sought to gain. Why did he choose the better watered plain in the first place? Why did he move into Sodom? Why did he take some kind of position in a wicked city? Well, we have to believe he did it all for self, wealth, popularity. And now at this point in the scriptures, we read that he is alone, that he has nothing, and no one cares about what he has to say. The scriptures say there that he lingered. The angels took him by the hand to drag him out. He didn't want to leave what he had. All that he sought for was destroyed. You know the rest of the story. God scorched it all with fire and brimstone. It's really a picture of God's judgment on sin. But on top of all that, the worst has to be that he lost his family. And you know about his wife. His wife so attached to her life in that wicked city, and seeking to hang on to it, looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Jesus, as recorded in Luke 17:32, admonishes us to remember Lot's wife. It's interesting, isn't it? It says, "Remember Lot's wife." And then he said these words in the next verse, "Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it. And whoever shall lose his life for my sake shall preserve it." Lot lost his wife. He lost his sons-in-law. He lost his servants. He lost everything that he had, including his wealth. And there would be future losses. Although certainly he did not realize it at the time, he did not see it coming, the worst impact would be the sin that would linger for generations. Sin has consequences on the sinner, but sometimes it goes way beyond that even, doesn't it? You know the other saying, you can choose to sin, but you can't choose what? The consequences of your sin. Let me explain what I mean by future losses. The toll was taken on his daughters as they committed incest with their dad. Not many years later, the offspring from that would harm Israel's relationship with God. The Moabite women would seduce the Israelites to bring God's judgment upon them as they traveled into Canaan. And then the Amorites that came from this incestuous relationship sacrificed children to their gods, and they introduced that practice to God's people. And so you might say that you can take the family out of Sodom, but it's hard to take Sodom out of the family. And I deliberately say that because I want to caution you, remember that when you allow your children to delve into the things of this world, it's not likely that they'll leave the world. Once you let your family become worldly, it's near impossible to bring it back. God, in God's grace, it can, but usually not how it works. And then you know that Lot is last seen in a mountain cave in a drunken stupor, and he's committing this gross sin. Would you now please turn in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2. If you're using one of the black Bibles in the chair racks, page 844. But 2 Peter chapter 2, and notice verses 6 to 8. I have them on the screen as well. It says, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly." That's us, right? "And delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man, dwelling among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds." Don't torment your soul by being around such horrible sin. It's what Lot did. And again, it's a sad commentary on his life. Lot tormented his soul with the wicked sins of the world he placed himself in. And my question would be, what about us? What about you? What choices are we making or could we make that could have a real negative spiritual impact and real negative spiritual consequences, some of which could be devastating? And not only to you, but those around you, especially those within your influence. So Lot just makes one poor choice after another. He chose to go his way instead of God's way. He went to the well-watered plains because he wanted to. He moved towards Sodom because he wanted to. He moved into Sodom because he wanted to. And he took a position in Sodom because he wanted to. Not everything we want to do is good and right and best. Teenagers, think about that. He did everything he wanted because he wanted to. And so, really, the conclusion here is, let's not make similar mistakes. Let's make the choices that God wants us to. And then remember that saying, sin always takes you farther than you want to go, keeps you longer than you want to stay, and costs you more than you want to pay. And so let's learn from the life of this man, Lot. And let's decide to make choices that will please God and be a real help to us and those under our influence spiritually. Well, let's think about that as we stand and sing a hymn of response. Would you respond? The Holy Spirit is speaking too. Maybe as we went through that, to your mind came some very important choices that you have in front of you. Make those choices based on what's best spiritually, even if it costs you something, because those costs won't be devastating. But the choices to do what is wrong and sinful could cost you